In 1862, 68 men rode out of the Texas Hill Country, trying to reach Mexico. They never made it. Confederate troops caught them at the Nueces River, and by the time the shooting stopped, most of them were dead. The strange part isn't the ambush. The strange part is that Texas spent the next 100 years deciding how it wanted to remember it. That decision is still visible today, carved into a monument in a small town called Comfort. And it's only the first stop. Texas doesn't do its history quietly. Every state has old buildings and old rumors, but this one has a habit of burying things, economically, geologically, sometimes literally, and then acting surprised when the ground doesn't stay settled. What follows are 8 places where that unsettled history never fully closed. Some of them you can drive to this weekend. One of them is a case file the Austin Police Department has never closed, on a killer who worked 3 years before Jack the Ripper and was never named. We'll get there. Start closer to the beginning. Comfort, Texas, sits in Kendall County, about 4 to 5 minutes northwest of San Antonio, and it was founded in 1854 by German freethinkers, immigrants who left Europe specifically to escape state religion and inherited aristocracy, and who built a town with no church for its first several decades on principle. When the Civil War arrived, most of Comfort's residents wanted nothing to do with it. Many were Union sympathizers in a Confederate state, and in August 1862, a group of about 68 men attempted to slip south to Mexico rather than fight for a cause they didn't believe in. Confederate cavalry intercepted them at the Nueces River. 19 were killed outright. 9 wounded men were executed afterward. The bodies were left where they fell. It took until 1866 for the remains to be gathered and brought back to Comfort for burial, and it took until 1994, over a century later, for the state of Texas to formally apologize. The monument stands in the middle of town today, one of the only Civil War memorials in the country dedicated to men who fought for the Union in a Confederate state. Locals will tell you the ground around it doesn't feel like ordinary ground. Whether that's history pressing on a place or just the weight of knowing what happened, there is something every visitor has to decide for themselves. That was the beginning of the list. It gets stranger from here. Northeast of Fort Worth, in Denton County, there's a truss bridge over Hickory Creek that hasn't carried regular traffic since the 1960s. Officially, it's called Old Alton Bridge. Almost nobody calls it that. The name that stuck is Goatman's Bridge, and the story attached to it has been told and retold so many times that separating the history from the folklore takes real effort. The history is grim enough on its own. In the 1930s, a black goat farmer named Oscar Washburn ran a successful operation near the bridge, successful enough that local clan members reportedly targeted him. Some versions of the account say he was lynched at the bridge itself. The documented record is thinner than the legend, but the town of Alton's decline afterward and the abandonment of the crossing are matters of record. What isn't in dispute is that the bridge became a fixture of local ghost stories almost immediately, and that generations of Denton County teenagers have driven out there specifically to test whether knocking on the railing 3 times gets an answer. Paranormal investigators have run instruments out there for decades. Nothing conclusive has ever come back. What keeps happening, generation after generation, is that people go out to disprove it and come back with a different story than the one they left with. Back in San Antonio, there's a hotel that opened in 1859 and has never really stopped operating, and never really stopped being talked about either. The Minja Hotel sits next door to the Alamo, and its early guest list reads like a cross-section of American history. Theodore Roosevelt recruited Rough Riders in its bar. Robert E. Lee stayed there. Sidney Lanier wrote poetry within its walls. But the story staff tell most often involves a housekeeper named Sally White, who worked at the Minja in the 1870s and was murdered by her husband in 1876, just outside the hotel. She's said to still be there, still working. Guests and staff over the decades have reported a woman in period maid's clothing moving through the halls on the 3rd floor, restocking towels, or straightening rooms that don't need straightening. The hotel doesn't discourage the story. It's part of the tour. What makes the Minja different from 100 other haunted hotel claims across the country is documentation. Sally White was a real woman. Her death is a matter of public record. The rest is up to you. South of San Antonio, in Golud, there's a stone fort with a tree in its courtyard that predates the fort itself, and the tree has a body count. Presidio La Villar was the site, in March 1836, of one of the worst mass executions in Texas military history. Colonel James Fannin surrendered over 300 Texian soldiers to Mexican forces under the belief they'd be treated as prisoners of war. On orders from Santa Anna, they were marched out and shot instead, over 300 men in a single morning, an event that became almost as galvanizing to the Texas Revolution as the Alamo itself. Fannin was executed separately, at the fort, reportedly beneath what's now called the Hanging Tree, though the exact method and location of his death are disputed by historians even now. The fort has been restored and is open to the public. The tree is still there. Staff and visitors have reported cold spots concentrated specifically around its base, not elsewhere in the courtyard, not in the chapel, just there, for as long as anyone's kept track. Skeptics point out that stone courtyards hold cold air unevenly. Nobody's ever explained why it's that particular 20 feet of ground. 342 men died in a few hours at that fort, and Texas built its founding myth partly out of the fact that it happened. It's easy to walk past a monument. It's harder to stand under the actual tree. On the coast, at the mouth of the Rio Grande, there's a lighthouse that's older than the state government that eventually took it over. Point Isabel Lighthouse was completed in 1852, and it did what lighthouses do. It warned ships away from the shoals guarding the entrance to the Rio Grande, through hurricanes, through the Civil War, through a coastal economy that boomed and collapsed more than once. It was fought over literally. Union and Confederate forces traded control of the tower more than once during the war, and it took damage each time. It went dark for decades in the early 20th century, decommissioned, sold off, nearly lost. Texas Parks and Wildlife eventually restored it, and it's open to the public today. The claim attached to the lighthouse isn't a single dramatic death. It's smaller and stranger, a keeper's footsteps on the spiral stays after closing, reported by park staff independently across different years, none of whom knew about the others' reports until they compared notes. No records show a keeper who died on duty there. Nobody has been able to explain what the staff keep hearing. The lighthouse still stands, still empty at night, and the stays still creak whether anyone official is on them or not. West Texas does this differently than the rest of the state. It doesn't need old buildings. It has distance and silence. And in Shackelford County, it has the remains of a fort that once anchored an entire frontier economy. Fort Griffin was established in 1867 to protect settlers and the buffalo hide trade moving through North Texas, and the settlement that grew up beside it, known simply as the Flat, became one of the most lawless towns in Texas history within about 5 years. Cattle drovers, buffalo hunters, gamblers, and gunfighters passed through in numbers the small garrison could never fully control. Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday reportedly met there. The murder rate, relative to population, was staggering even by frontier standards, and most of those deaths were never formally investigated, let alone solved. The fort was abandoned in 1881 once the buffalo were gone and the railroad moved the cattle trade elsewhere. What's left today is a set of ruins on a windswept rise, maintained as a historic site, visited mostly by people who already know what they're looking for. Longtime area residents describe an unusual quiet out there. Not silence exactly, but the specific kind of stillness that settles over a place that used to be loud and violent and now isn't anything at all. That quiet is the thread connecting almost everything on this list. Places that were once full of people, full of noise, full of purpose, and then, abruptly or slowly, weren't. Nowhere is that more literal than at Indianola's northern cousin on the Gulf Coast, the town of Linville, in Calhoun County, which existed as a thriving port for barely a decade before it was erased in a single afternoon. Linville was founded in 1831 and by 1840 was one of the busiest ports in the Republic of Texas, a trade hub handling goods bound for San Antonio and beyond. On August 8, 1840, a force of roughly 600 Comanche warriors, in what's now remembered as the largest Native American raid ever to strike so deep into Anglo-Texan settlement, swept into Linville itself. Most residents escaped by boat into the bay and watched from the water as their town was looted and burned to the ground over the course of a single day. It was never rebuilt. The raid, retaliation for a treaty massacre at San Antonio's council house earlier that year, where Comanche negotiators were killed under a flag of truce, set off a chain of violence that shaped Texas-Comanche relations for a generation. There's nothing standing at the old town site today. No ruins, no monument beyond a small historical marker. Just grass, coastal wind, and a stretch of Calhoun County shoreline where a town of several hundred people existed and then, in the space of an afternoon, simply didn't. Locals who fish that stretch of coast say the market gets visited more than you'd expect, for a place with nothing left to see. Everything so far has a shape you can trace. A war, a massacre, a fire, a fort that outlived its purpose. The last one doesn't. In December 1884, a young black cook named Molly Smith was murdered in Austin, Texas, in what would become the opening act of a killing spree that lasted just over a year. Over that year, at least 8 people were attacked and 5 were killed, most of them women. most of them attacked at night, most of them killed with an axe. The victims were overwhelmingly black domestic servants at first. By the end, the killer had struck 2 white women in a single night in the same wealthy neighborhood, and the panic that had been largely confined to Austin's black community exploded across the entire city. The press called him the Servant Girl Annihilator, a name coined, according to most historical accounts, by a young journalist working in Austin at the time named William Sidney Porter, who would later become famous under the pen name O. Henry. Austin in 1885 was a city of roughly 16,000 people. It hired extra police. It imposed an early curfew. Bloodhounds were brought in. Pinkerton detectives were brought in. Nothing worked. The murders stopped as abruptly as they started, in December 1885, and no one was ever charged. The case predates the Whitechapel murders in London by nearly 3 years, and some historians have pointed out the structural similarities between the two: urban terror, mutilation, a press-given nickname, a total absence of resolution, closely enough to wonder whether the same person committed both. It's a theory, not a finding. No evidence has ever connected the cases directly. What's certain is that Austin's killer was never identified, the file was never closed, and the city that experienced one of the earliest documented serial murder panics in American history has spent the century since mostly forgetting that it happened at all. That's the pattern underneath every place on this list, if you step back far enough to see it. Texas doesn't memorialize its darkest chapters evenly. Some get monuments and apologies, 100 years late but delivered all the same. Others get a bridge nickname and a bar bet about who's brave enough to drive out there after midnight. And some, like a killer who worked the streets of the state capitol in 1885 and vanished from the historical record almost as completely as he vanished from the crime scene, get almost nothing at all. No name, no monument, no resolution. The land doesn't keep score. People do, selectively, and only for as long as it's convenient to remember. Somewhere in Austin, less than 2 miles from the state capitol building, there's a stretch of ground where 5 people were killed in 1885 by someone who was never caught, and most of the people who drive past it every day have no idea it's there. Thank you for watching the video. If you like it, consider subscribing to our channel for more such videos. Thank you.